All right, Shabbos say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin a good tavach. Lift galag ba'omer. Aschus Baruch Hashem to be able to begin a new week together, learning together, growing together. Baruch Hashem. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our TAMLUD Torah sponsor for the month of ER, an anonymous sponsor dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month with Hakaras Hatov to Hashem, for all of the blessings He has bestowed upon us, and for refuah Shleima for Devorah Leah bas Chaya Rivka. May we all be zoche Hashem to witness the imminent coming of mashiach b'mehira b'yameinu. Amen. Our week of learning sponsors, Milton Melanie Gertner, in honor of the wedding of their son Drew Ari, to Shira Shamouilian in Yerushalayim. The Gertners are there. I think the Chazan is today or tomorrow, but Emeretz Hashem, they are there celebrating the Chazan today. Chazan and Kala should be gebenched and should be zoche Emeretz Hashem to build a bayis and be Yisra ad meve asim shanim tovos. And our day of learning sponsors, Seth and Rachel Rotenberg, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Seth's father, Zev ben Chaim Shmuel Zichrona Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TAMLUD Torah, all of the neshamas shav and aliyah, the families in the all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. We should just be zoche Emeretz Hashem to besoros tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. I just want to mention just before we get started, there's been something that's I'm sure many of you saw it. It was sent to me by a number of different people. You know, I mentioned yesterday morning in shul that one of the so many things have changed for Klal Yisrael over the course of this war. And to me, one of the striking things was the idea that this year, even Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva were adversely impacted by the war. Because obviously, understandably so, that the government could not allow the same gatherings in the north of Eretz Yisrael. So there was very limited access to Rashbi, to Meron, very limited access to Rabbi Akiva. And so I don't know why, in the midst of all things that were happening in the world, it hit me that when Klal Yisrael suffers, everyone suffers. Everyone suffers. That's what it means to be part of the cloud, that everyone feels the enormity of both our simcha and our tzara together. So that even Rashbi and even Rabbi Akiva were impacted by what's happening to their children this very day. And then someone forwarded me last night, Meir Salman and a whole bunch of people, then afterwards, but Meir was the first, an incredible piece by Rabbi Shmuel Silber, who is the chief rabbi of Tzfas, and he writes as follows. He says, Sipra Avimori Harav, so he's talking over here about his father, Mordechai Eliyahu, B'melchemes Sheishes Hayomim Shaisa Krova Lag Ba'omer. So the 6-day war also took place around, again, Lag Ba'omer time. V'ratzu Kama Rabbanim La'alos L'tzion Shel Rashbi. And a number of Rabbanim wanted to go to Meron, to the grave of Rashbi. V'lo Nasnu Lahem Mibchina Bitchonit. But obviously they weren't allowed to because of security issues. V'hayalahem tsar gadol. As one could understand, not to be with one's Rebbe, right? Not to be with Rashbi, unlike Ba'omer, is a very painful thing. And listen to this. He says, V'rashbi nigle b'chalom lekama anoshim. So this is an incredible story. They say that Rabbi Shmuel appeared in a dream to a number of people. V'amar lahem, ani nimtza banegev im hachayalim, l'shmor aleim, v'lo timtzu oti b'meiron. Rabbi Shmuel appeared to people in a dream, and he said, I'm not in Meron this year. I'm with the soldiers. V'achein haisatzlacha gidola ma'ot uschus Rashbi amdali am Yisrael. And what an incredible and beautiful idea. Rashbi said, when Klal Yisrael needs you, I'm with Klal Yisrael. I'm in Meron when things are quiet, when things are a little bit easier, when everyone could come to me. But when my children can't come to me, I come to my children. I will say, that's the people we're a part of. So it was such a nechamet. I saw this late last night. Josh just showed it to me again this morning. And it was such a nechama, that when the children can't come to Rashbi goes to the children. And I would imagine whatever is true for Rashbi is true of Rabbi Akiva as well. And what a nechama to know that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva and the Avos and the Imos and David and Shlomo and everyone is with each and every one of our precious soldiers. Meretz Hashem Halavai, our precious Chayim should feel the support of previous generations. We shall all be zoche Meretz Hashem for Mashiach, for Geula, for Tchias HaMesim, and Halavai. We won't just have to see Rashbi in a dream, but we'll be zoche Meretz Hashem to feel His beautiful embrace on this incredible day of Lag Ba'omer. Halavai Mehera B'Yameinu. Amen. We'll say with that, let us begin. Just a good way to start Lag Ba'omer. So I'll post this on the chat in Meretz Hashem afterwards as well. So we'll say, we are picking up. Today's daf is Peches 88. He'll say, we're back in Gemara. We're back in Gemara. We had such a Daf Yomi honeymoon period, right? It was, last couple of days were just literally me'ein olam haba. Me'ein olam, people have different opinions, and I got two very different. Some people were like, I can't wait to be back to regular Gemara. Right? And some people were like, I never want this to end. I want this to end. I love Haggadah Gemaras. I personally find them much more difficult than regular Gemaras. Yeah, regular Gemara, just there's a beginning, there's an end, there's an argument, there's opinions. Haggadah, there's so much depth and there's so many different meanings. And okay, but Baruch Hashem, we're zoche to be able to have both. So today's daf is Peiches 88. We are picking up Ella Amar Shmuel Amar Kra. So we'll say which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 23 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say, so remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to the idea that halacha l'maisa, when a worker is working in the field, so he has the ability to go ahead and partake of that which he is working with. Obviously subject to certain criteria. Namely, he has to be working with something that is mechuber, attached to the ground, and halacha l'maisa, something that is nigmar malachto, that is fully finished. That is fully finished. If it meets those two criteria, then he is permitted to go in and partake of it. Now remember, the Gemara the Gemara explains that this halacha is brought down in two interesting contexts. Number one, it's brought down by a vineyard, and number two, it's brought down by kama, by standing wheat. So I know that if you have a Jewish worker working in a field, in a vineyard, or working with standing grain, he's going ahead, the object is attached, or the produce is attached, and he's harvesting it, that he is allowed to eat of it while he's harvesting it for his employer. The issue the Gemara is dealing with now is, how do you know to apply it to everything else? So what we're trying to do, is create a paradigm. The paradigm would be that anything ultimately, again, that is attached to the ground and is fully finished, the worker is allowed to consume of it when he goes ahead and harvests it. So we're trying to figure out how do you create the paradigms. Here we go. So Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra. So Shmuel says the pasuk is like this. Chemesh. The pasuk says chemesh. I will say chemesh literally means a sickle. A sickle. So what does that mean? The Rabbos call bali chemesh. That comes to include that anything that is harvested with a sickle is subject to this same halacha. Again, I will say just keep the halacha being that when a worker works with the produce, he is permitted to eat of it while he's working. So we'll say, no, we need that chemesh, we need that sickle to teach me a different halacha. What halacha? To teach me that it's only at the time that the sickle is being used, i.e. the harvest season. Only the time of harvest, ultimately, again, that you are permitted to go ahead and that the worker is permitted to eat while working. But if it's not the harvest time, he's not permitted to go ahead and eat. So the Gemara says, Hahu, me ve'el kel yacha lo sitein. So we'll say, no, I can learn that from a different pasuk. The pasuk says that when the worker is working, he's permitted to eat, but he can't put it into his baskets. So we saw this already in yesterday's daf, this idea that halacha l'maisa, as a worker, I'm permitted to eat, but I can't take for myself to take home. So the idea over here is clearly, we're talking about a time of a harvest season. So the Gemara says, Tinach de bar chemesh. So fine. So now I understand, Rabbi saying, that I can apply this halacha to anything that is harvested with a sickle. However, again, the lav ber chemesh min alam, how do I know if something that is not harvested with a sickle? How do I know that it is still subject to this halacha? El Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Kra, kama, the rabbos called bale kama. So therefore, the pasuk says kama. So what is, to teach me anything that is bale kama? Rabbi said, bale kama in this context means anything that is mechuber lekarka. Anything that is attached to the ground is subject to halacha. So we'll say, so here's what Rabbi Yitzchak is floating, right? Rabbi Yitzchak is suggesting that the word kama teaches me anything that is attached to the ground, mechuber lekarka, and is fully finished and now being harvested by the worker has the right to eat of it while he's working. Okay? So one says, amrit, kama de mechayv b'chala. But we learned before that Allah Kama taught me that anything that is subject to the laws of chala, is subject to this halacha. That was before we darshan chemesh. Hashta the asi chemesh is Rabbi le kol debar chemesh. Now that I have chemesh, Rabbi says, so chemesh tells me anything harvested with the sickle, ultimately again it's subject to this halacha. And even if it's not subject to the laws of challah, it'll still ultimately again be subject to this halacha of worker consumption. So the Gemara says, Kama lamali. So if that's the case, then what is Kama coming to teach me? The rabbos call ba'alei Kama. It's coming to teach me about say that this halacha, what we'll call worker consumption, is permitted by any type of produce that is attached to the ground. That's the halacha. The hashta. So we'll say, so now, here's what I've got, right? So I've got now, we'll say, essentially we have a whole bunch of drushas kind of simultaneously unfolding over here. So now I'm learning it out from Chermesh, right? And I'm learning it out from Kama. Those seem to be the two primary drushas that teach me worker consumption. So the Gemara says, Kisavo bekerem re'acha lamali. Why do I need that phrase of, when you come into the vineyard of your friend? Amar Rava, lehel chosav. Rava says, no, because the pasuk in its entirety teaches me a variety of halacha. So I'll say, so what will come out over here is, from the word chermesh and kama, I will learn the primary halacha of worker consumption. Now, I'll say, now just to be clear, the Torah explicitly talks about the right of a worker to consume produce when he's working. The issue we're running into is, it explicitly mentions it by a vineyard and by standing grain. How do I know to apply it to everything else? So ultimately, again, that's where chermesh, that's where sickle comes in. So now we'll say, so now what do I do with the rest of the pasuk? This is really fascinating. Here we go. Kidisanya. Kisavo. The pasuk says, when you will come to the vineyard of your friend. Kisavo ne'emar. So sorry, ne'emar kan biya v'ne'emar lahalon lo savo alav hashemesh. So we'll say, listen to this. The pasuk uses the lashon of biya, right, of an entering. Uses that lashon over here by worker consumption. And it also uses that lashon, we'll say, of paying your workers. The halacha is, the Torah says, Lo sava lo hashemesh. We'll say, if you have a day laborer, the halacha is, there's a biblical obligation to pay your workers on time. Right? And the halacha is, if someone is a day laborer, the Torah says, you can't allow the sun to set without having paid your worker. So the Gemara says, just like by paying the wages of your workers, talking about a laborer. So the Gemara says, Afkan medaber. So too over here, both say by worker consumption, is dafka talking about a laborer. In other words, the right. See, here's what's interesting. The right of someone to come into my field and consume produce is dafka only by a laborer, right? It's only by a worker. Even though the lashon of the pasuk is kisavo bekerem reacha. When you come into the vineyard of your friend, I don't know, maybe Halloween is, you would have thought, hey, if we're buddies, I can go ahead and just come into your vineyard and go ahead and eat of your produce. No, just we have exer shava of bia. Just like kisavai lo savo, by a worker, by a laborer, by wages, doesn't matter worker. So too again, kisavo bekerem reacha is talking about a worker. The right of worker consumption is dafka by a laborer. Okay, let's go weiter. It says bekerem reacha. Furthermore, it says in the vineyard of your friend, velo bekerem kusi. We'll say first wide line in the bottom of 87b, page 9 of the base. Velo bekerem kusi. So this is actually very interesting. The halacha ultimately again of kerem reacha. This refers ultimately again to the vineyard of your friend, but not to the vineyard of a kusi. Now, both say, now what halacha is it talking about over here? So Rashi says there, kerem re'acha, bel kelyecha lo sitin aval kerem kusi titin. We'll say the halacha is, for worker consumption, that a worker has the right to go ahead and take of the fruit and eat it as he is working. What doesn't he have the right to do? He doesn't have the right to put it into his kli, to put it into his utensils to bring home. You can't go ahead and take leftovers, right? That you can't do. So we'll say, or not even left. In other words, you can't pack up in order to take with you from the vineyard. So the Gemara says, this is dafka adin in the kerem of your friend, but doesn't apply to the kerem of a kusi. So apparently, if you're working for a kusi, halacha l'maaseh, not only are you allowed to go ahead and eat while you work, but you could pack up and take with you as well. So the Gemara says, gezel kusi aser. So we'll say, this makes it according to the opinion that says that generally, theft from a kusi is aser. That's why I need the pasuk to teach me that it's permitted to take of the produce of the kusi and put it into my utensils. But according to the opinion that says, right, we'll say this presupposes two things. Number one, that a kusi is treated as a non-Jew. And number two, that gezel akum is permitted. So again, I will say, if you take both of those things to be true, then hashtag gzela mutar pomi boy. So I will say, if theft is permitted by a kusi, then it goes without saying that what? It goes without saying that Allah Chalamaysa, if I'm working in the kusi's field, I certainly could put stuff in my basket to take home with me. To which the Gemara says, The Gemara says, Mokim la bekerem re'acha v'lo shal hektish. Okay, so that opinion will say that halacha l'maisa, this halacha only applies to your vineyard or to a vineyard of a person, but not to a vineyard of hektish. So I will say, this is actually an important halacha, that the idea over here is, and these are all, but I will say, I want to point out, these are actually all true statements. The concept of worker consumption only applies in the vineyard of an individual. Let's say again, the Beis Hamikdash owns vineyards. As I will say, Pashtos, the Beis Hamikdash would own vineyards. It makes sense for the Beis Hamikdash to own vineyards, right? Because this way they have their own libational wine. Their own libational wine. So Lamaisa, again, I will say, let's say I'm hired to work in the vineyard of the Beis Hamikdash. I tell you the truth is, I'm not like a big manual labor guy, but I would take that job. I absolutely would take that job. Right, so let's say, so let's say now I'm working in the vineyard of the Beis Hamikdash. So let's say the halacha is this din of worker consumption does not apply in hektish. So you can't eat while you work of the produce of the Beis Hamikdash. Interesting halacha. The achalta, so we'll say furthermore, the pasuk says you can eat from the vineyard that you're working or from the produce that you're working. V'lo motzeitz. This is interesting. What can't you do? You can't. I guess like motzeitz means like to suck. I guess like when you're eating grapes, what you could do is like you could take a bite and like suck out the moisture and leave behind the grape skin. You can't do that as part of worker consumption. Worker consumption is eat the grapes, right, whole, or don't eat at all. What's the pshat? Because it will say, if you're just sucking the moisture out of the grapes, what's going to end up happening? You're going to eat half of that vineyard, right? So the idea over here is because there's no satiety in that. So halacha l'maisa, again, if you're going to eat, you're allowed to. You have a license to do so. But halacha l'maisa, the license is only for full grape consumption, not for sucking out the moisture. Anavim, furthermore, you're permitted to eat the produce of grapes. Anavim v'davar acher. But ultimately, again, not anavim is something else. So I was supposed to say, what will be the something else? Rashi points out to the air, you can't dip the grapes in salt. So what's the pshat? Salt is something that increases your appetite. So the idea over here is you can eat whatever the produce is, but there's no condiments, right? It's just the straight produce, and that's it. Okay, kinafshicha. Furthermore, again, I'll say literally again, the pasuk says if you're the laborer, you can eat as much as you want. Kinafshicha, kinefesh shal balabayis, kach nafshol shal poel. In this respect, consumption of the laborer mirrors the consumption of the owner. How so? So the Gemara says, man nafshicha ochel upater. I will say just like the owner, ultimately again has the ability to eat, and the produce is not yet subject to tithing obligations. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, "Man nafshecha ochelu pater ben hamaiser, tahalo nikmar malachto lemaiser disnan yai mishered lebar." So I'll say, interestingly enough, grapes that are being used for wine consumption or wine production only become subject to maiser when they're put in the vat. So just like the owner is able to consume ultimately without any tithing obligations, so to the worker has the ability to say when the worker consumes in the field, he has the ability to consume without tithing. Savacha. So we'll say, so the worker is permitted to eat until it's filled, but he can't eat. He can't overeat. Pasuk says, worker, you're allowed to eat, but you can't go ahead and put it into your utensils. So the Gemara says, "B'shash ata nosein lekelev shabalabayis ata ochel, u'b'shash ata nosein lekelev shabalabayis ata ochel." So we'll say, what's the halacha? The halacha is like this: when you, the worker, are putting the produce into the utensils of the balabayis, that's when you're allowed to eat. But if you're not working for the balabayis, you're not allowed to eat. Okay, so we'll say, so all of this frame the parameters of this incredible halacha. So we'll say, really, this is like the whole sugya of worker consumption. So now we see, again, a source, right? Really like a multi-pronged source for this concept. That's number one. And halacha l'maisa, all of the other details concerning this entitlement, all spelled out over here. Beautiful. Now we'll say, now the Gemara is going to switch gears just for a second over here, because the Gemara indicates something very interesting. That halacha l'maisa, the Torah equates the worker to the owner. And just as the owner, if he were to go into his own vineyard and pluck grapes off the vines, they would not be chayiv in meiser, right, in any tithing obligations. Because remember again, tithing only sits in when? Mishenigmar malachton, when it's considered to be final produce, fully produced, or fully finished. fully finished. So just like when they're in the field, they're not fully finished, so too the worker could also consume without any type of tithing obligation. So now the Gemara is just going to switch gears for a little bit to speak a bit about tithing obligations. We actually just saw this Gemara 2 days ago. Rabbi Yanai, Ein Chatav Mischayev b'Meiser. We'll say, so generally untithed produce is not chayev in Meiser. Ta'apav Pechas, Ad Shira Pnei Abayis. Ultimately, again, until it goes ahead, until you bring it into the front door. So we'll say, so again, they're talking really about over here. Right now, Rashi points out, even if you gathered the produce into a pile in the field, still tithing obligations don't set in until produce is taken in the front door. Pnei Abayis, Rashi says, Shekanis derech haPesach shu Pnei Abayis v'lo derech gagos v'karfil. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So halach l'maisa. In order to create tithing obligations, the produce has to come into the front of the Hashem Mar, bi'arti hakodesh min habayis. Because the pasuk says by vidui meiser, right? When there's confession that I've done all of my tithes, the lashon is I've removed the kodesh from the home. So the idea is, you see from here that items only become obligated in Trumas and Maasros when they're taken into the home. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan says no. Afilu chatzar kovas. Rabbi Yochanan says not true. Rabbi Yochanan says, even once the produce is in the chutzner, is brought into the courtyard, ultimately, again, that creates the tithing obligations. Where does he get that from? Shneimar, v'yachlu b'sharecha v'savehu, because the pasuk says you will eat it in your b'sharecha, within your gates, and they'll be sated. So we'll say, fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. At what point in time does produce become subject to tithing obligations? Rabbi Yanai comes through the front door. Rabbi Yochanan comes even into the chutzner. Okay, I think what's Rabbi Yochanan? Nami haksim min habayis. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with the phrase Birati hakodesh min habayis? What do you do with the bayis? So Amar lecha chutzner dumya de bayis. Because Rabbi Yochanan will say like this: it's teaching me that in order for the chutzner to generate tithing obligations, the chutzner has to be like the bayis. How so? Ma bayis hamishtamer af chutzner hamishtameres. Just like a bayis is mishtamer. Right, just like a home is guarded, so too the chutzner has to be guarded. So I want to say, by the way, it's such a beautiful idea. Also, like, what is the definition of a bayis? What is the definition of a home? The definition of a home is a place that is mishtameres, that is guarded. The whole avoda of a home is to figure out what am I allowing in and what am I keeping out. If the bayis is not mishtameres, if the bayis is simply open to every single influence, to every single thing, that's not a bayis. You know what you call that? You call that a sada. That's called a field. What makes a bayis is that there's a conscious decision about what is allowed in and what is kept out. And it could very well be that perhaps, again, it's not even enough, maybe contemporarily, it's not even enough to have a bayis that's mishtamer. Maybe the shmira even has to start at the chatzar, right? The chatzar has to be mishtameres. Again, so many negative and so many negative influences that bombard us day in and day out. That you need a chatzar mishtameres also. But if I can't have the chatzar mishtameres, at least the bayis are also incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Good. Av chatzar mishtameres. Rabbi Yanai, who says that produce only becomes subject to tithing obligations once it comes in the front door. Rabbi Yanai, nami haksi b'sharecha. What does he do? What does he do with b'sharecha? Hahumi bayile d'ma'ayile derech shar. So we'll say this comes to teaching that what? That halacha l'maisa, you're bringing it in the normal entrance way to the chatzar. Lafuke derech gagos karfifos telo. To exclude ultimately, again, I will say, remember we saw this before, that if you bring in your produce, literally again by way of your roof or terraces, in other words, you avoid the front entrance. Technically speaking, you could go ahead and circumvent the tithing obligations. Remember, again, I will say, just to remind you, we had this before when the Gemara wanted to contrast Doros Harishonim with Doros Hachronim. Earlier generations to previous generations, right? So the Gemara says present generations, Doros Hachronim, latter generations, tried to actively circumvent the tithing obligations by bringing in their produce through the roof, through the skylights, through the back, whereas earlier generations, Dafka wanted to trigger the obligations to tithe when Dafka bring their produce straight in the front door. Okay, so here's what's interesting. Fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, about what triggers tithing obligations. Rabbi Yanai, front door. Rabbi Yochanan, chatzar. But everyone is agreeing that it has to be brought somewhere out of the field into either the home or the chatzar to trigger the obligation. Now watch this. Masib Rav Chanina Chozah. So Rav Chanina Chol brought up a kasha. What's this kasha? Ki nafshecha kach nafsho shapal. So we'll say one of the drushes we had on the bottom of Pei Zayin of the base. The pasuk says ki nafshecha. So what does that mean? Ki nafshecha kach nafsho shapal. Just like the owner operates in the field, that's how the poel, the worker, operates in the field. How so? Ma nafshecha ochelu pater, af nafsho shapal ochelu pater. Just like the owner eats and is not yet subject to any tithing obligations, so too the laborer eats and is not subject to tithing obligations. The Gemara says, what do you see from here? Ha lokeach chayv. Now I will say it's tafka, the owner and the laborer, who are both exempt from tithing obligations when the produce is in the field. But what do you see from here? If somebody purchases produce, and the produce is in the field, that sounds like what? That would be subject to tithing obligations. Why? Because a sale almost like concretizes the finality of the produce. So therefore, again, you see from here that even if the produce is in the field, but you purchase it, it's subject to tithing obligations. Well, that's a kasha both in Rabbi Yana and Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, no. And Rabbi says, interesting case over here. What are we talking about? We're talking about a fig tree that is where the trunk of the tree is standing in the garden, standing in the orchard, right? But it has a branch that is extending into the chatzar. And I was saying, I watch this, and now the person is buying of the figs that are extended into the chatzar. So watch this. Leman, so the Gemara says, or according to the opinion that says, Rabbi Yanai, that says it's the home, ultimately that triggers tithing obligations, the branch is extending into the home. Now I will say, now watch this. So I will say, so that would be the case ultimately again, where the purchaser would be obligated in tithing obligations. Why? Because the moment he purchases it, right, the produce is already either in the chatzar or in the home. Okay, that's the case. So Gemara says, if that's the situation, if that's the case, then the Bala Bayis should also be chayiv. Why is it only a case of a purchaser who's chayiv? He'll say, if I own a fig tree, right, and the branches of that fig tree are extending into the chatzar according to Rabbi Yochanan, or into the house according to Rabbi Yanai, so then I will say, then Allah Lamaisa, my produce is already in the house, in the chatzar. If it's already in the house, already in the chatzar, then what? I should be obligated for tithing obligations. Two students will say, no, it's incredible. Bala Bayis einav b'tei naso. The Bala Bayis will say, has his eyes on the trunk, right? When I'm the balabais, when I'm the owner of that fig tree, I'm not focused on the location of a particular branch, but rather I'm focused on the location of the trunk. Since the trunk is in the field, therefore, again, for my purposes, this produce is outside of my home, this produce is outside of my chatzar. On the flip side, v'lokeach einav b'mikcho. A purchaser, his mind is focused on that which he is purchasing. So for him, he's focused on the figs that are on the branch, which is in the house or which is in the chatzar. So therefore for him, that's what he's focused on. And therefore for him, as soon as he buys it, ultimately again, the tithing obligation is triggered. Incredible. So the Gemara says, now this is very interesting. Now, what's interesting is as follows, which is that the idea over here that the Gemara is highlighting is that apparently when you go ahead and you purchase produce, the act of the purchase, take a step back. In general, when does produce become subject to tithing obligations? When it's what we call gemar melacha, when it's finished. Now, finished is a relative term that obviously, again, will also be somewhat subjective depending on the type of produce. Here, we're giving some objective metrics. So, for example, you bring that produce into your house, right, according to Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Yanai, or into your chatzar, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's finished. Now, the other piece the Gemara is saying is, when you purchase something, the act of purchasing essentially finishes the item. So that when you purchase something, even though there might, for example, I'm purchasing grapes. The reason I'm purchasing grapes is because I want to make wine. But the act of purchasing itself makes it as if the object is finished and triggers tithing obligations. That's the Gemara was suggesting. So now the Gemara questions that. Is that true? Is that true? That when you purchase something, that, so to speak, makes the item finished, that now goes ahead and triggers tithing obligations? So as well as listen to this. Vatanya, we learned. We'll say, why were the stores of Beis Hino destroyed? Shalosh Shana Kol Yerushalayim. So I will say, so apparently again, Rashi says Beis Hino is a place. So the stores, the chanuyos, the stores of Beis Hino, were destroyed 3 years before Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh was destroyed. So the Gemara says, why is that? Because it's very interesting. Because apparently the shopkeepers of Beis Hino decided that they were just going to follow biblical law and they're going to disregard rabbinic law. Now, if you look at the last Rashi before we turn the page, Rashi says over here, Shemidu divrayim kilomar masha asrum midivrei chachamim matzulo heter min haTorah. So they essentially said, you know what? We're going to be good Jews. We're going to go by what Hakadosh Baruch Hu said, but we're not going to be bound. We're not going to get caught up on what the rabbis are saying. What do they say? Listen to this. Shahayu omrim, because they used to say, Amud Beis, Shahayu omrim, aser ta'aser v'achalta, below mocher. So listen to this. They said midaraisa. It's actually very interesting. I will say, by the way, we're going to see they're not wrong. They're not wrong, but they're interesting. So aser ta'aser v'achalta. So the pasuk says, you shall tithe and you shall eat. Below mocher. So I will say it's interesting. What are you obligated to tithe? Only stuff that you yourself. I will say now they're like a shtickle. They're like a shtickle chassidish with this, because what they're doing is they're juxtaposing two psukim and kind of reworking the punctuation a little bit. So aser ta'aser v'achalta. So they're dashing from here that what below mocher. Below mocher. It is only what's subject to tithing. Only produce you consume and not produce you sell. Not produce you sell. So commercially held produce, ultimately again, not subject to any type of tithing obligations. Furthermore, tvuas zaracha, it's only produce that you go ahead and you plant, v'lo lokeach, and not anything that you purchase. So what the shopkeepers of Beis Hino wanted to say was like this: commercially sold and purchased produce is not subject to tithing. So what is subject to tithing? The stuff that you grow and you eat, that's subject to Trumas and Maasros, right? But halacha l'maaseh, anything that you sell or anything you purchase is not subject to tithing mid'oraisa. Ukra asmachta elam d'Rabbanan. Rather, again, it's the rabbis who said, no, you have to tithe everything. Not only do you have to tithe the stuff that you grow and the stuff that you eat, but you even have to tithe the stuff that you sell and the stuff that you purchase. Cross machta ba'alma. Fine. Shabbos says, now watch this. So now what's the point the Gemara is making over here? Shabbos says, so interestingly enough, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, that seems to be that midda oraisa, purchasing produce, is not subject to tithing. Not subject to tithing. After all, again, I will say, just to be clear, what was the mistake of the people of Beis Hino, of the shopkeepers? It's not their drasha that was mistaken. It was their disregard for rabbinic law that was problematic. So the Gemara says, Ela midraban, Ela kinafshecha l'mayasa. So what does kinafshecha come to teach me? Because listen to this, the Chiddush Sanya. Kinafshecha is actually very interesting. Man nafshecha im chasamta pater. I will say, if I'm in a field, and I decide to go ahead and I decide literally to muzzle myself. Now, what does that mean? If I decide I'm not eating from my field, right? I of course have the right to do that. So to af poel im chasamta pater. So we'll say the fact that the pasuk equates the owner with the laborer says that just as the owner has the ability to say I'm not eating of my field, so too he has the right to say, he has the right, so to speak, to muzzle the laborer. Now let's analyze this. Rashi points out there something very interesting. Rashi says, what does it mean to have the right to muzzle your laborer? What it means is like this. You could make a deal with the laborer that essentially says as follows: I'm going to pay you more money so that you don't eat of the produce. You can reach an agreement with that. Now, you can't force the laborer not to eat without compensation, right? Because eating while he's working is his biblical right. In fact, not just right, they will say, well, it is a right, but it's also an entitlement that he has as a worker. Probably, I will say, in the Moshe's chashbon, this really, what it does is effectively, it increases his wage, right? Because he's getting paid whatever he's getting paid. Plus, based on what we've seen is, he also gets meals, and he also gets snacks, right? He also gets, he also gets to eat from whatever it is that he's producing, or whatever it is that he's harvesting, working with. However, just like I as an owner have a right to say, you know what, I'm not partaking, so too I have a right, so to speak, to muzzle my worker, as long as I reach an agreement with him. Gemara says, Masid Mar Zotra, Ezuhu, so the Gemara says, Ezuhu, Goran and the Maestros. So Mar Zotra is the Kasha. So I will say, when it comes to, so what is considered to be, when is the time in which, Ezu Gorana Lemaisros Bikishum B'Daluim. So Rabbi say, when it comes to cucumbers and gourds, at what point in time do they become subject to Meiser, tithing obligations? To which the Gemara says, Mishayipkisu. Ultimately, again, Mishayipkisu. What does it mean, Mishayipkisu? Rashi points out over here, Mishanita Pikas Shalahem, V'perach HaGadol Barosho, V'davak Bo, Ula'achras Manu Nofal B'Talash. So Rabbi says, so apparently when cucumbers and gourds grow in the initial stages, they have like a blossom, a flower type of thing. So when it falls off, that's ultimately, again, I guess, when they're considered to be ready. And that point in time, the tithing obligation sets in. Rabbi Asi says, it doesn't have to be that it falls off, but even when it's removed. My love, afilu b'sada. Shabbos say, doesn't this not mean that if the blossom is removed, right, whether it falls off or removed, even in the sada, which Shabbos say shows you what? That produce becomes subject to meiser, even in the field. Shabbos say, this is a kasha. Why is it a kasha? It contradicts both Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. Because as much as Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, they had a machlokes, is it the entranceway of the home or the entranceway of the chaser, which triggers the tithing obligation? One thing is clear, which is what? It's not the field. It's not the field. And here we're saying it is the field. To which the Gemara says, lo, mishayifkesu babayis. No. It means when the blossom falls off in the house. Ihachi, mishayifkesu ad sheyifkesu mibayile. If that's the case, it shouldn't say when, but rather it says until. It should say until. Itana ad sheyifkesu havamina ad gamar lepikusayu. So we'll say, if it would have said ad sheyifkesu, you would have thought that it only becomes subject to tithing when all of the blossoms have fallen off. Kamash malon, mishayifkesu nichi aschule pikusayu. Therefore, we'll say, the Gemara used lashon mishayifkesu, which means, interestingly enough, you don't need all of the blossoms to fall off. Rather, what? As soon as some of the blossoms have begun to fall off, ultimately, again, it is subject to tithing. So I will say, so again, I just want to be clear. So just to stay focused over here, what we've really transitioned, right? We started over here with the discussion, ultimately, again, about the worker consumption entitlement. Right, that the worker is able to eat while he's harvesting. We pivoted a little bit to now a whole discussion about when does the tithing obligation begin. In that subject, there is a fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai, produce needs to come through the front door in order for the tithing obligation to be triggered. Rabbi Yochanan, even into the chatzar. We're just lobbing like a whole bunch of questions at these two respective shittas. Let's go weiter. Masei Mar Zotra, Bereid Rav Nachman. Garno l'maiser l'chayv ala mishum tevel. So we'll say ultimately again, what is considered to be a garn? We'll say garn means when is it to become a finished product, right? In order ultimately again to be subject to tithing. Mishatigmar malachton. Ultimately again, when the produce is finished, right? Tigmar malachton means the work is done with the produce. I ve'ezu gimar malachton. What is considered to be gimar malachton? Meleches hachnasasan. The gathering in of the produce. My love hachnasasan afilu b'sada. Should I both say, so now remember again, there is a gathering, right? There is a gathering in the field, because often what happens in the field is produce is often piled, right? The produce is often piled in the field, left there for a little bit of time to dry out. So it sounds like what the Gemara is saying over here is that maybe once it's put into a pile in the field, that's considered to be finished, and therefore again, tithing obligation sets in right there. But once again, where is tithing obligation setting in? Where is it setting in? In the field. Contradiction or kasha both on Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. No. Lo hachnasasan lebayis zehu gemar malachta. No. It means when it's brought into the home, right, or brought into the field, that's the brought into the chaser. That's gemar malacha. The Ibai says another possibility. Ki kam Rabbi Yanai b'zeisim va'anavim delav b'nei goreninu. Or Rabbi say could very well be that Rabbi Yanai is referring to olives and grapes, which are not b'nei goren, are not really stored. Right, these items are not stored. Remember again. Olives and grapes are really taken from the field to the press. They're never stored. So the Gemara says, when it comes to chitin and se'or, wheat and barley, which ultimately again are stored, then halacha l'maisa, it could very well be that their tithing obligations in fact does take place as soon as they are piled in the field. Okay, so what I say now, that ends our tithing discussion. So we'll say, what do we emerge from this? So I just want to point out, these kinds of gemaras are very important, even if we don't remember the shachal, the whole back and forth, because what they do for us is they give us certain principles which we're able to take with us. So we're going to come back to workers in just a second, but Lamaisa, what we emerge with from this discussion is, first of all, how do we paskin? At what point in time is produce generally subject to tithing obligations? So we paskin, the Rambam paskin is like Rabbi Yochanan, that it's Mishira B'nei HaChatzer. Doesn't even have to come into the bias. Rather, once it comes into my chatzer, into my courtyard, that's what triggers tithing obligations. Now, that's true for certain types of produce, but other types of produce that are considered to be finished, so to speak, at an earlier stage. For example, grain, which is often piled in the field and then left to dry out. Once it's in a pile, it's done. It's done, and that triggers the tithing obligations right there. Incredible. I will say what we also see, something fascinating. That midda oraisa, the only type of produce that is subject to tithing, is produce you grow and you eat. But technically speaking, produce you sell and produce you purchase, midda oraisa, is not subject to tithing. Midda rabbanon, Chazal equated everything, and they said it doesn't matter, you grow it, you don't grow it, you buy it, you sell it, everything is going to be subject to tithing obligations. Incredible. Incredible what I was saying. Listen, we should just know, when you learn these Gemaras, there is an incredible excitement with it. Always figure out this. Remember, the same way that we are makbid, right? We are very careful to say karbanos every single day. I want to say that again. We are makbid to say karbanos every single day. Every single day. Why? Because uneshama parim sifasenu. Because if in the absence of a Beis HaMikdash, where we don't yet have the opportunity to say karbanos, Chazal tell us that the recitation of karbanos is tantamount to the actual giving of the karbanos. And I will say, by the way, it's going to sound strange to us in a certain way, saying of karbanos is even more powerful than bringing karbanos. Why? Because I will say, if halacha l'maisa today, you decide, you know, let's do this Beis HaMikdash, halavai today, and you decide, you know what, I want to bring a carbon toda. You can't, right? In other words, certain karbanos you can't bring unless there is an obligation that triggered their bringing. Other karbanos you can bring even on a voluntary level. So I'll say, but yet when you say karbanos, you can say all of the karbanos every single day, and ultimately it's as if you brought them. So I'll say same thing when we learn about Shumas and we learn about tithing obligations. So while it's true that these tithing obligations only devolve upon the produce of Eretz Yisrael. So I don't have the ability. I go to 7 Mile Market and I buy produce, right, and I bring it home. There's no Shumas and Maestros from that. But when we learn these sugyos, learn these gemaras, it's as if we're separating Shumas and Maestros from it. So just feel the beauty in this. That in these gemaras, I'll say, for those couple of moments we're learning these sugyos, we're in Eretz Yisrael. For these couple of moments we're learning these sugyos, we actually are tithing our produce. Halavai should be zoche to do it in person. So let's go back there. Says the Gemara, a lot more to do today. Yeah, good. Fine. Ashkechan. Okay, so we'll say back to workers. Ashkechan adab b'mechober v'shabatal. Shabbos said, let's make a run for this. Here we go. So now, here's what I know. I now learned the halacha, both of adab b'mechober and shabbatalish. Now, what does that mean? I now know about the concept that when a worker is working in a field and he's harvesting produce, what's the halacha? He's allowed to eat. Right? And now that I know, that applies to anything that is mechuber lekarka. Okay? That's what I know. I know also that there are limitations. What are the limitations when the worker is working? What are the limitations? He can eat. What can't he do? He can't put in his utensils. What else can't he do? Can't suck on the grapes. What else can't he do? No salt. What else can't he do? Achila gase, can't overeat. Okay, so now I know that. What else do I know? I also know shar b'talash, that when an animal is working the field, that an animal is allowed to eat detached produce. Now, where do I know that from? We didn't learn that. That's a pasuk. Lo sachsom shar b'disho. You cannot muzzle your ox when it is threshing. Now I both say, how do you do threshing? I know. When we had it, how I was supposed to know how to do threshing, right? Again, threshing is you essentially have wheat on the ground, right? This is in my youth, I did some farming, right? So it's in the shtepel. Right? So again, you take the ox or the cow, and it literally steps on the produce, right? It walks on the produce, and by doing that, it separates again the wheat from the chaff. That's dosh, that's threshing. So the halacha is, Torah says, you can't muzzle your ox when it's threshing. You have to allow it to eat. Now, I will say threshing, by definition, is done with detached produce. So the Gemara says, I have two paradigms. I know that a worker is allowed to eat from attached produce, and that a shar is allowed to eat from detached produce. Adam betalosh minalan. I don't know about say that if my worker is working with detached produce, that he is allowed to eat while he's working as well. So the Gemara says, Kavachomer Mishar. It's Kavachomer from Mishar. Masha she'ena ochal b'mechobra ochal b'talosh. So a shar which is not permitted to eat from attached produce is permitted to eat from detached produce. Adam she'ochal b'mechobra eino din she'ochal b'talosh. A person who is able to eat from a chobar certainly can eat from talosh. Interesting Kavachomer. So the Gemara says it's not a good one. Mal shar shekin atam mitzvah chasimaso. I will say shar is different. Why? You can't muzzle your shar yet. So you don't say you can muzzle your worker. Now remember again, let's qualify. What does it mean you can muzzle your worker? What does that mean? What does that mean? You could pay him off not to eat. Not to eat. So there is the ability to muzzle your worker, so to speak, but you can't muzzle your shar. 1 second. Why don't we say that you can't muzzle your worker based on the Kavachomer? Mishar, from shar, what's the Kavachomer? Umashar shiata mitzvah lachayoso. So I will say a shar, you are not mechuyav to go ahead and sustain your shar. I will say there is no obligation to literally again sustain your shar. Right? I will say if you see a shar, right? If you see a shar, right, and you see the shar struggling, I don't mean like a shar struggling underneath its burden, but I see whatever you see a shar, you don't have an obligation to go out of your way to sustain a shar, but yet. I'm sorry. So a shar that you have no obligation to go ahead and be mechaya and sustain a shar, but yet you have a prohibition to muzzle him. So I will say by a person, you do have an obligation ultimately. So I will say, by the way, this is incredible. I will say, where is the obligation to go ahead and be mechaya and sustain your brother? Incredible. You're not going to believe it. You're not going to believe this case from the Ribbon Shalom. Where is it? Yesterday's parasha. Right? V'chai achicha imach. I was saying, you ever have one of those days where you're like, I'm not sure exactly why I'm doing this, right? Maybe you didn't find the sugyas of Trumas and Maestros so riveting. Right? Maybe your mind wandered a little bit and you think to yourself, you know what, maybe I should be learning something different, paying a bit more attention. And then what happens? Akash Baruch Hu says, no, I love you right where you are. I love you exactly what you're doing. This is absolutely fantastic. So I will say, how could it be that in a 7.5 year cycle, there's a Gemara that references a pasuk that we literally read yesterday. Could have been a week later, 2 weeks later. Is this on? I was like, this is incredible. You can make up a lot of stuff in life. You can't make up a Daf Yomi cycle timing thing, where a pasuk from Parshas Bahar shows up towards the end of. Okay, fine, whatever. I'll do magic show next time. I'll juggle fire. Guys, you guys are second sky, dude. All right, so the Gemara goes, guys, listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Amar kra'ah kinafshecha, kinafshel shel poel, ma nafshel im chasamta pater." So we'll say, just like ultimately again. Like the owner himself, if he muzzles himself, remember again, the owner could choose not to eat. Okay, so we'll say, so now ultimately again, so how do I know elam adam betalosh? So we'll say we're trying. So now we know, and this is what we spent pretty much a good part of Pei Zayin Amud Beis and the beginning of Pei Ches Amud Aleph, or really Pei Zayin Amud Beis, focusing on this idea that a worker is allowed to eat attached produce. So I will say, now we're transitioning. How do I know that a worker, if he's working with detached produce, let's say I hire a worker, the field was harvested, he's working with stuff already, or for that matter, I will say, let's say the grapes were harvested, right? The grapes are off. So now let's say he's transporting the grapes somewhere else. How do I know that even though he's working with detached produce, he's allowed to eat? How do I know that? Adam Metalish Minalam, Amekra, Kamo, Beis Pam. I will say the Torah uses the word Kamo. Right, 2 times. So I will say, so one kama teaches me that a person is permitted to eat from attached produce. So maybe the second kama, what does the second kama come to teach me? The second kama comes to teach me that the worker is permitted to go ahead and eat even from detached produce. Rabbi Ami Omer, Adam b'talosh lo tzarech kra. Rabbi Ami says, no, you don't need a pasuk to teach you Adam Talosh, that a worker is permitted to eat detached produce. Why not? So the Gemara says, watch this. Ksiv, we'll say first wide line, Pechesam base, 88b. Ksiv, Kisava B'kerem Re'acha. So we'll say, the pasuk says, when you come into the vineyard of your friend, so like the labor, we'll say, this is the pasuk. Kisava B'kerem Re'acha, Milo Askinon, Shesaka L'Kasev, V'am Rachmana Lechol. So we'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, this is fascinating. So the pasuk says, Kisava B'kerem Re'acha, so this is the pasuk. Torah says, if I hire a worker in my vineyard, he's allowed to eat the grapes. So we'll say, it's so interesting. We presuppose that what is the pasuk talking about? Why is the worker there? Right? Why is the worker there? What is he doing? He's picking the grapes. The Gemara says, no. Why do you think he's picking the grapes? Maybe the grapes are already picked. And what is he doing? He's transporting the grapes from point A to point B. He's taking it from the field to the vat. And what does the Torah say? When he's transporting it, ultimately he's allowed to eat. So Rabbi say, and by the way, Rabbi Ami, it's such an incredible drush because Rabbi say the pasuk makes no reference to picking grapes. All it says is kisavo bekerem re'acha. When you come into the field of your friend, why are you coming there? To work. And then it says, while you're working, v'achal tanavim kinafshecha. Eat whatever you want. It makes no reference to picking, which says, Rabbi Ami, that whether you're picking or you're transferring. I will say, by the way, it's such a Musar Haskell. What's the Musar Haskell? I will say, I don't know, at least me, I automatically assume the pasuk is talking about harvesting. And because you make that assumption, therefore you see the pasuk in a certain way. See, I will say, in life, we make certain assumptions about things, and therefore those assumptions dictate the way we see reality, dictate the way we see the world, dictate the way we see ourselves. I will say sometimes the most important avoda in life is to kind of do a little bit of a double check on your assumptions. Because sometimes the assumptions you make, which then dictate your reality, may not be correct. And if I'm operating with wrong assumptions, then my reality is skewed as well. So my assumption always was that the pasuk is talking about harvesting. Rabbi Ami says, where does it say harvesting in the pasuk? It makes no reference to that. Therefore, Allah somebody comes into work. So whether he's harvesting, whether he's transporting, ultimately, as I must say, again, we go through life with so many different assumptions about things I'm able to do, things I'm not able to do, my capabilities, my lack thereof. Stop. Maybe you have to take a step back and say, are the assumptions in which you are looking at yourself, looking at the world, are they correct or are they incorrect? And if they're incorrect, I may have been living with a glass ceiling of my own creation. Suddenly, again, it could very well be that the world is much bigger. My yicholes is so much greater than I originally thought. So incredible. Okay, so that's Rabbi Ami. So Rabbi Ami says, you don't need, guys, you're barking up the wrong tree. You don't need a pasuk to teach you that a worker is allowed to eat from talosh, from detached produce. It's the pasuk. It's the same exact pasuk. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Sharma Mechaber. Let's just finish. Sharma Mechaber. How do I know that a shar, that even if an animal is working, that an animal is permitted to eat from detached produce while it's working? Come from a person. A person who's not permitted. A person who's not permitted to eat from talosh. Again, I will say, we're going to see what that means. In certain circumstances, he's not permitted to eat from talosh. Yet it's permitted to eat from mechubar. So therefore, a shar who does eat from talosh could certainly eat from even attached produce. Mar says, no. A person, you're obligated to sustain him. A shar, you're not obligated to sustain him. It's incredible. Maybe you should be obligated to sustain a shar. The chai sharcha imah should be a kavachomer from Adam. Uma Adam she'ata mitzvah achasimaso ata mitzvah lachioso. I remember again, by a person, you can muzzle a person. Again, I want to qualify this. Once again, you could muzzle your worker. Remember again, how do you quote unquote muzzle your worker? How do you muzzle him? Pay him off. You could accomplish a lot by paying people off, right? By muzzle him, so you could, so to speak, you could financially, in other words, pay him off so he doesn't work. Fine. So the Gemara says, so you can muzzle. So, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So a person, you're quote unquote permitted to muzzle, you're obligated to sustain him. Shar sha'ata mitzuva al chasimaso. Eino din sha'ata mitzuva al achioso. So Rabbi say a shar, who you are obligated to go ahead and muzzle. Right? You can't muzzle. Certainly you should be obligated to sustain it. Amar-kra, v'chai achicha imach. Rabbi say, here it is. Pasuk from yesterday's parsha. The pasuk says, you must make sure that your brother is able to live with you, i.e. you're obligated to sustain the life of your brother. Achicha v'lo shar. Your brother and not your shar. Not your shar. So again, we're back to square one. We'll say, so remember again, here's the good news. Let's not focus on what we don't have. Let's focus on what we do have. What do I have? I know that a worker could eat by mechuber and by talush. That's what I know. I know that a shar could consume by talush, by detached. What am I missing? How do I know that a shar is permitted to eat from mechuber? So let's finish this up. Re'acha base panim. People say it's a fascinating drasha. It says re'acha twice. Your fellow, right? The Gemara says im eno adam. So one re'acha teaches me about my worker, that my worker is permitted to eat, and now I know both from mechuber and from talush. But what do I do with the extra re'acha? So the Gemara says im eno adam mechuber teneo inyan l'shar mechuber. If I don't need that second re'acha to teach me that a worker is permitted to eat from mechuber, then what? Use it to teach me that a shar is permitted to eat from mechuber. So Rabbi say that's it. Now we have all four. I've got Adam, right, a worker, both by mechuber and talush, and now I have shar by talush. Talush is an explicit pasuk, right? Losaksum shar b'disho, and now I have shar by mechuber also from the extra re'acha. I will say it is fascinating to see, right, that the Gemara entertains. We're not finished yet. I will say, but it's fascinating to see. I mean, we're finished for today, but not finished with the sugya. Don't get nervous. I will say, but it's interesting to see how the Gemara is learning out the ability for a shar to eat with attached produce from re'acha. Re'acha means your fellow. So I will say it's important to understand. Remember, this whole idea of not muzzling your animal is a din, ultimately again, of compassion on animals. And remember again, we've seen this before. This goes back to the Rebbe Gemara. Right? That what did Rebbe attribute his illness to? Right? What did he attribute his illness to? That when that little calf ran away and hid under his cloak, he was indifferent. I don't even know if it's cruel. He was just indifferent to it. It's like go and be slaughtered. That's what you were created for. The calf no tzart. That's what you were created for. So you see this theme, right? You see this theme. How ultimately, again, that compassion is necessary. It's almost like I will say, it's not a din in animals. I think it's a din in us. It's kind of the same way if someone tells you that with Jews, I'm very honest in business. But with others, I feel the right to take certain liberties. I'm not a businessman. But I would say, don't do business with such a person like that. Right? Or a person ultimately, again, who speaks negatively about certain Jews. But let's say in life, if you want to create a harmonious spiritual personality, you can't have two standards. You just can't have two standards. So the Rebbe Shalom models this for us. Kodesh Baruch Hu is v'rachamov, I'll call ma'asov. See, Rebbe Shalom doesn't have compassion on someone. Kodesh Baruch Hu is compassionate on everything. So it's interesting over here. Torah is teaching us that in order to be compassionate human beings, that compassion has to extend to everything. Obviously, it's not the same compassion for animals that it is for people. That's a crooked mentality, right? But l'maisa, it is interesting to see that it almost like if you want to have compassion on re'acha, you're going to have to take that same skill set and apply it across the board as well, even to your shar. I will say, wow, first of all, nice. By the way, this is what an actual Daf Yomi shir looks like. This is what a real Daf Yomi shir. I just want to point out, it's nice sometimes to get a little glimpse on how it looks. I'll say, don't get used to it. Shkayach everyone, continue tomorrow.